Being a chartered manager means that you are a specialist in that area, and it means you've got all the skills to do the job to the best of its ability.
You are seen as a leader, a true leader who has credentials behind the great work you've already been doing.
It's enhanced my understanding, it's enhanced my skill set, it's improved my mindset.
It makes all the difference.
This session is recorded and will be available on the CMI website and YouTube channel. Join the conversation by using the live chat box for your questions and comments. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's digital event, Leading Innovation, Navigating the Startup Frontier. My name is Amelia Phillips, and I'm an event delivery coordinator at CMI. Don't forget to join the conversation by using the live chat box, and feel free to ask any questions you have for the speakers, and we'll answer as many as possible during the Q&A session. I will now hand over to Emma, the event lead for the Wales Regional Board, to begin today's event.
Brilliant, thanks Amelia. Hope you can all see me. So good afternoon and welcome to our event today. Great to see so many people signed up. In today's session, our speakers will explore the evolving landscape of enterprise startups, and we'll have a sharp focus on the use of AI and the green tech sectors. So I'm going to be hosting the conversation, so let me introduce myself. I'm Emma Bell-Davis. I'm the Vice Chair for CMI Wales, and I'm also the events lead. I'm a leadership professional, and I work in leadership and professional development with lots of different organisations. I have a career spanning executive advisory and coaching roles, and I've spent nearly 2 decades in the energy sector, where I led high-performing technical teams as the head of exploration and development. I helped make organisations help them to make complex and high-stake decisions on a global scale. And I now work with senior leaders across sectors specialising in strategic direction, change, cultural transformation, and supporting executives to lead with clarity, confidence, and impact. I'm really excited to bring together 2 speakers today, both of whom I've worked with, or I'm working with at the moment. So firstly, let me introduce you to Dr. David Gold. He's founder and CEO of an award-winning Welsh business called EcoDetect, which uses AI-enabled monitoring systems for detecting wildlife and man-made objects in the marine environment. So welcome, David. David and I worked really closely together for many years when I was heading up the exploration team in CGG, so it's great to have you here. I'm also joined by Gito Davis, the Head of External Affairs at Green Cymru, where he leads the business's external engagement strategy to support the delivery of major energy infrastructure projects across Wales. Gito is also the chair of Conwy Mind, a local mental health charity, where I also serve as a trustee alongside Gito. So great to have both of you together, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where this conversation takes us today. So let's get you to introduce yourselves a little bit more. So David, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what your business focuses on.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, very nice to be here today and speak to everybody. So my name's David Gold. As Emma has said, we worked together previously, and I've worked in the energy sector, energy and environment sector for over 10 years now. And in the last 2 years, I started this business, EcoDetect, and we create AI-powered wildlife detection and monitoring systems, mainly for offshore renewable energy applications. So monitoring things like offshore wind, as well as some subsea infrastructure. And there's a lot of projects going on in this space in Wales, and we're very fortunate to be based in Anglesey. We've been going 2 years now, which I think is a pretty good achievement for a startup business. And yeah, we're seeing some real growth on the horizon, which is really positive for us.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks for that introduction. Great to have you here. Gito, over to you. Tell us a little bit more about you and your role.
Yeah, hello everyone. Great to be here. Yeah, I'm Gito Davis. I'm Head of External Affairs at Green Cymru. We are an IDNO, Wales-based IDNO. We got our license from Ofgem back in July 2024. So we'll be celebrating 2-year anniversary of being an IDNO this summer. Emma, as you said, I lead our external engagement strategy. So that means working with policymakers, with communities, industry partners, and lots of stakeholders across the private and the public sector to support the delivery of our projects. As a business, our focus is very much on designing, building, and then operating the new electricity distribution network that Wales needs to connect renewable energy, particularly in Mid and West Wales, and to unlock some economic and community benefit along the way. Before sort of making the move into the private sector about 5 years ago, sort of crossed into the dark side. I spent a number of years in policy and public affairs. So I work closely with government and industry on energy policy and sustainable development. So jobs in Parliament, membership bodies, and then Natural Resources Wales for about 18 months. So a good mix that I now try and bring into my role at GreenGen.
Brilliant. Thanks both, and really great to have both of you here. Thank you for your time today. So we've got quite a packed agenda with lots of questions to cover. So we're going to have a look at kind of leadership challenges. We're going to try and cover sort of several dimensions of like technology, environmental, regulatory, operational, cultural. We've also got some pre-submitted questions. So let's have a go at navigating this. So if we start off with kind of like leadership challenges, and we think about that sort of vision and strategy. So David, I'm going to come to you first. So how do you envisage the long-term impact of new technology?
I think it's really important, and particularly here in Wales, we're really leading the way in the development of technology surrounding offshore renewable energy development. I'm sure Gito will also talk about onshore renewable energy, but we specialise in offshore, and there's a huge amount of activity in this space. You have the Mentor Morlais tidal energy site offshore Anglesey, as well as the expansion of some of the fixed offshore wind farms that are being planned, and pushing offshore wind into deeper waters with floating offshore wind. So the sector globally is really looking at Wales as a leader, and to see what what they can learn from the technology that's developed in that sector here. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to really develop the technology and showcase all the skills and talent that we have locally, and then export that globally to the world. So it's a really good time to be based in Wales developing this technology.
Brilliant, thanks David. And Gito, what about your perspective? So long-term impact of new technology.
Yeah, I think individually and as a business as well, we see technology as an enabler of better decisions, not just quicker ones. So in the long term, technologies like advanced data modeling or sensing and digital infrastructure, in my world, it's going to allow us to design and operate energy networks in a way that's far more responsive to environmental conditions, and for Wales in our case that means unlocking onshore renewable potential. Just last month, earlier this month, to mark St David's Day, as a business we announced the ACCC Cardiff, so the Cardiff conductor on our infrastructure, so the first of its kind, big bit of innovation which allows us to carry higher levels of power on smaller towers. So anywhere in the world now where they use that configuration, it will have to be known as the ACCC Cardiff. So Wales is leading the way when it comes to new technology. I think beyond Wales, we'll probably see this type of approach, and a lot of the approaches that David's talking about there, we'll probably see that become standard. So integrating planning with where environmental data, grid infrastructure, and community priorities are considered as one system rather than in silos, I think.
Yeah, that's great. It'd be great to have it as one ecosystem, right? That's what we're all striving for. So Gito, coming back to you again, what strategic decisions have been the most difficult in balancing that kind of commercial viability of the business with that environmental and sustainability sort of responsibility and goals from that startup perspective?
Yeah, and I think the work that we're very mindful as a business that the work we're doing, it's quite an ancient sector, right? We've been building energy networks for decades, but we're an IDNO that's been operating for just under 2 years. I think the hardest decisions are rarely about choosing one over the other. I think it's more about timing and the trade-offs, if I'm being completely honest. So, for example, if you're investing more in environmentally sensitive routing or additional mitigation measures, as we try and do as a business, that inevitably can increase upfront costs and complexity. But if you don't do that, you create delay, opposition, potential long-term ecological impacts that ultimately carry greater costs, both financially and, I would argue, more importantly, reputationally as well. So the challenge is making decisions that may not be the cheapest or quickest in the short term, but are clearly the most sustainable over the lifetime of a project. Now, that is incredibly difficult for startups because we know how difficult the economic environment is at the moment. So I think to get over that, you need really strong internal alignment. You need really good data and just confidence in the long-term policy direction, which I'm sure we could argue for hours whether we've got that at the moment. But those should be the ingredients for a good recipe.
Yeah, interesting. Let's not go down the political angle, right? Let's keep this into the leadership space. I find that really interesting because, you know, I obviously coach lots of different businesses and I talk to them about innovation and when is the right time to implement changes. And really it's a lot earlier than you think. And actually there's so many things that are going into your decision making there, Gitta, around, you know, the timing, the policy, the, you know, leaving it too late and then creating that vacuum of lack of communication can be really challenging as well. So thank you for your perspective there. David, what about your perspective on this? So this kind of balance around commercial viability and environmental and sustainability. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and I agree with Gitto that there's almost there's the upfront costs, you know, environmentally and also commercially that you have to be wary of, particularly as a startup who, you know, your resource and cash constrained at the beginning, but you have to take that sort of longer term view that you know, if you act environmentally responsibly, then those commercial opportunities will come. And something that we're looking at the moment is that we use a lot of hardware, so marine sensing equipment and things like that at the moment, or we initially started importing from China because it was quick and cheap and easy. But we're actually now going through a process of onshoring our supply chain. And we're a key ethos in our business is to use as much local supply chain as we can and promote opportunities for people from the local community, and that is then recognized in some of the larger contracts for these offshore renewable developments, where you have things like the clean industry bonus, where the government will provide sort of subsidies based on having a local supply chain. So even though it's you know, you'll be looking at perhaps more costs involved in the equipment and procuring that and using that initially, then hopefully that is then offset by the likes of the clean industry bonus and you sort of get that commercial return later on.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to come back to you, David, and let's talk a little bit about sort of some of the technical challenges in using AI and then sort of transmitting data models to accurately in this sort of dynamic underwater environment. So talk to me about some of the challenges that you've been overcoming from that tech side.
Yeah, and there are plenty of challenges that we need to overcome. You know, anytime you're putting equipment in the marine environment, it carries an element of risk, not just HSE risk, but also technical capability risk. And we find as we push out to deeper waters, so further distances from the shore, but also deeper waters, the challenges sort of increase exponentially, really. So particularly when we're using AI models, we find it's key to get that right from the outset, and do pre-deployment tests as much as we can, because once we've deployed that model on the seabed, a few kilometers offshore, it's really difficult to communicate any changes and back to it. It's not to say it's impossible, but I think identifying those key components in your system is really key, and it sort of comes back to that local supply chain element that we've just been talking about as well. Is, get to know your supply chain really well, build those partnerships, have confidence in the equipment that you're using, and test everything as much as possible before you put it out into the sea. And that's sort of the strategy that we've been taking, is sort of test, and hopefully that pays off once you've deployed it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And if we think about environmental and some ethical considerations now, so large scale renewables also have environmental and social footprints. So Gisto, just coming to you, how do you navigate those sort of trade-offs between that rapid kind of decarbonisation and then the local environmental landscape concerns?
Yeah, I think this is, one of the defining challenges, I would say, for us as a business and for the energy transition more broadly. I think in my world, and as a business, we've probably got three overarching principles that we always try and think about. So, firstly, avoid where possible. So how can you use data and early engagement to really steer the infrastructure away from the most sensitive areas? Minimize where we just can't avoid. So that means through really smart design choices, construction methods, and there's shed loads of great innovation happening in the construction sector that I think sometimes gets overlooked. And timing as well is a big one there. And then finally, just in terms of engaging transparently, the energy transition will only happen if we bring communities with us. Communities and stakeholders, need to understand both the need for infrastructure and the steps being taken to reduce the impact. So I don't think there's anything such as zero impact infrastructure, but there is probably such a thing as responsible infrastructure, right? So ultimately, I would argue if you fail to build the networks needed for renewables, that also has a very real environmental cost through continued carbon emissions, and it will be the same in other forms of infrastructure as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a transition, right? And David and I work together really closely, and at the start of our careers, we're all around oil and gas exploration, and we might have transitioned into different energy sectors and different technologies, but you can't just switch it off, right? It's a transition, and we have to look at how we transition away from some of those traditional methods. Anything that you want to add from your perspective, David, on that question around that sort of environmental and ethical concerns in terms of the way you're operating in your business?
Yeah, well, just to continue that message, really, it's clear we do need to transition, right, to more renewable, clean energies, because if we don't, the consequences of that is quite dire, and we have to communicate that to people as well, and I think engaging all the stakeholders in the community is really important, and try to talk to them about the benefits that this technology or this infrastructure will bring, not only sort of environmentally, but also to jobs and the local community as well. And I actually find offshore wind farms quite beautiful, so I don't necessarily have a problem with them. And even onshore wind farms, I can see some from my office window. I quite like looking at them, and a lot of the tidal energy devices that we're working with are actually mounted on the seabed, so you don't see them at the surface anyway. So so that there are different perspectives to where we position these renewable energy infrastructure.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. Let's switch our mind to sort of regulatory and the sort of policy landscape. So I'm curious from both of you really around what regulatory hurdles you've encountered in deploying your technologies, let's just say, around the UK or Wales in particular. David, what have you encountered so far in terms of that regulation piece?
I think it's just a bit of education, I think, is required. We do a lot of trying to demonstrate our technology to regulators, and I think, as Gito mentioned earlier, the way we do things hasn't changed a lot in a long period of time, and particularly in the sector that I'm working in. Environmental monitoring is usually done manually. You'll have marine mammal observers that will go out on a boat or from the shoreline and try and identify and count numbers of marine mammals. That's great. It's a really great thing. Provides really great data, but it only provides a snapshot of the population at that time. Whereas if you deploy monitoring technology, you can generate data in real time, sort of 24/7, and we need to explain that to the regulators. So we actually received the world's first regulatory approval for use of AI monitoring for tidal stream turbines up in Scotland, and that was a big piece of work. Working with the Marine Directorate licensing operation team up in Scotland, and once we sort of finished showing them the benefits of our technology and increased accuracy related to in comparison to a human manual review, then it really helps get that sort of regulatory buy-in into the technology that we're producing. So yeah, we found that really helped. Yeah.
Brilliant, and what a great achievement. Well done, well done. What about your perspective, Gito, around that regulatory and policy piece?
I think there's probably two thoughts that spring to mind. I think, if you're a startup or you're a smaller business, it is sometimes easier to innovate because you haven't got historic ways of working that can often be embedded in businesses that have been operating for decades, right? So we are very, very lucky in our business to have people who have been in this industry for 30, 40 years, who have seen the challenge of coming to a relatively new small business and are able to innovate and make decisions to innovate in the space of sometimes 6 weeks, where in lots of other businesses it might take 3, 4, 5 years, right, to get that approved. So I think leaning on that as a startup is really important. I think if I draw on my experience in previous roles and at the environmental regulator as well, I think the regulatory landscape is complex, right? Like, just cannot get away from that. And I think in some areas it's still trying to catch up with the pace of technology and energy system change. And I think one of the main challenges that the consenting processes were just not designed with the scale and the urgency of the transition in mind. So projects can span multiple regulatory regimes. So, David's marine licensing, planning, environmental assessment, and aligning all of those timelines can be really difficult. So there's definitely a need for clearer frameworks, I think, around how new technologies and data can be used within decision making. That said, I think to try and be positive to our regulatory friends in government, because they hear these arguments a lot, I know, is I think there's a real strong recognition, right, from governments and regulators that reform is needed. And we are starting to see some positive steps to a more streamlined and strategic planning approaches, which will hopefully help businesses be able to innovate quicker.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Let's think a little bit about team culture now. So if we think about leadership strategies, so what leadership strategies have you both found effective in kind of building the multidisciplinary teams that span the aspects that you're both covering? Because you're both really diverse in terms of what you're doing. So Gitto, what's your perspective on that?
I won't name any names. I've worked with great leaders and I've worked with not so great leaders in my time. I think what sets great leaders and just really high performing teams apart is how do you create a shared purpose that cuts across different disciplines. So people come with very different expertise. In our business, that can be engineering, it can be data, it can be policy, environmental management, legal, but they all need to feel like they're working towards the same outcome, right? So for us, that's enabling an energy system that works for Wales. I think practically, what that means is encouraging collaboration early in project design. So as much breaking of silos as you can, valuing different types of expertise equally. That's easier said than done, but I think those that really try to do that you can really see the reward in doing that, and just creating space for constructive challenge as well. I think one of the things that I've observed in this role I'm in now is just how well we create a space for constructive challenge in our change control process, for example. So if you can translate between disciplines, technical, policy, community, those perspectives are understood then, and I think respected a bit more across an organisation as well.
Yeah, interesting. So it's around that sort of creating that vision that we're all working towards. And then I really like the bit about constructive challenge. I mean, I guess that, you know, if we think about some of the things that we're handling on the board as well, it's creating that space, isn't it, for people to disagree, because we're human, and it's important for us to be able to bring our whole selves to the roles that we do. So thanks for that. David, what are your perspective on that sort of team culture and leadership strategies?
Yeah, it's really important to have that freedom to express your opinion and have that sort of level of trust and comfort, I suppose, within the team, that you know, anybody can be challenged constructively. Of course, is the best way to go. But you know, everybody's opinion has a value, and you know, we're a very innovative team. We spend a lot of time on R&D and creating new ways of doing things, and people have a lot of their own ideas. So we encourage people to go out and try those things. Don't be afraid if it doesn't work out. You know, at least we've learned from it. And just have that sort of trust in the team that they will deliver to the best of their ability, and put some sort of autonomy on them as well. I find it is really empowering for team members to believe they have that trust to kind of go ahead and come up with an idea and run with it, and report back the results honestly, and we'll see, you know, we'll see what comes of it. But we're really lucky to have a really diverse team in terms of sort of technical expertise. We have people that are pure computer scientists, as well as people with a pure sort of marine biology background, and we find it's really helpful to celebrate that diversity. And there's a lot of knowledge sharing that goes along, and I find that really enjoyable because I learn so much from our team members, and they certainly have a lot more sort of technical prowess and experience that are really going to help us sort of drive our business forward.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So some brilliant ideas there around that sort of psychological safety, allowing everybody to be themselves. It's so important, and that diversity that you're talking about, is going to bring richness of thought process. If we all look the same, sound the same, talk the same, we're not going to get that breadth of our thought process. And it's so important in that startup environment where it's all hands to the pump in terms of innovation, different ideas. So sounds like real good recipe for success there. So let's move on and talk a bit about stakeholder engagement. So how do you go about managing complex relationships? I mean, both of you are working in slightly different areas, but I can imagine that both have quite complex stakeholder engagement that you need to be working with. It could be coastal, rural communities, infrastructure developers, conservation groups, etc. So how do you go about managing those relationships? David, what are your thoughts on this?
Visibility and clear communication is key for that. So be involved in those conversations. We work on both sides of the coin, as it were. We work with the developers. We want to help facilitate them to get their projects consented and deployed, but we also work with the regulators to make sure that that's done responsibly. So we do a lot of work going out into the community. We do a lot of work talking to schools about what we do, and speaking to conservation bodies as well. So there's an understanding of what's being tried to, what we're trying to achieve, and the technology that we have in place that hopefully can facilitate some of that responsible renewable energy development.
Excellent. Thanks, David. And Gitta, what about your perspective on this? I mean, I can imagine some of the stuff that you're doing really has quite challenging conversations, shall we say?
Yeah, you know what you get yourself into. I say whenever you make a career change. I mean, I love what David mentioned there, just in terms of like engagement with schools and stuff. One of the best parts of my job is trying to deliver our social value strategy. So engaging with charities and organizations and universities and schools. That's one of the best parts of the job. I think if you're going to really manage relationships and stakeholders well, it starts with early and meaningful engagement, right? So not consultation as a tick box exercise, but genuine dialogue. And I think probably every single one of us on this call has got an example of perhaps a development in their own local area where perhaps they say, well, that wasn't quite up to par. So we've in the nearly 2 years that we've been operating, we've sent almost 50,000 mail shots. We've held over 50 events. We've had close to 10,000 attendees at those events, and near enough 6,500 pieces of individual feedback. And what is really clear from all of those conversations is that different stakeholders have got different priorities, right? And sometimes those priorities are our intention. Our role and my role is to be transparent about those tensions. So explaining what the rationale behind those decisions are, and to look for ways to incorporate feedback wherever possible. I think people can overthink it sometimes as well, and I would just say that trust is your number one currency, whether you're a startup or a large business. That is built over time through a lot of hard work, but also some consistency. So doing what you'll say you'll do, and being really open about what you can and can't change, and I think people will respect you more for it.
Yeah, excellent. I really love that kind of early and meaningful piece that you said there, Gitto. I mean, you can use that principle for every conversation, I would say, because if you don't have early and meaningful conversations, so many things get missed, don't they, in any business, whether it's a startup or an established business. So great. What about challenges? I mean, both of you talked about engaging with the community, and I guess that sometimes when you're trying to communicate the value and maybe limitations of what you're trying to do, how do you transcend that sort of technology to non-technical boundary? Some of what you're trying to transmit here is probably quite complicated. So how do you transcend that boundary? What's your perspective, Gitto?
I think it's the single biggest challenge for us as a business, right? And like anybody in my world, that misinformation piece it's rife in the energy sector. I think one of the challenges is avoiding both oversimplification and over promising. I think there is a tendency in emerging technology spaces to present solutions as more certain or as more advanced than they really are. In my world, the age-old argument between overhead lines and undergrounding cables, I never thought I would be going to bed thinking about undergrounding as much as I do. But I think we try and be really clear about what technology can do today, what it might be able to do in the future, and where uncertainties remain. And I think if you're able to use relatable language and ideally some real world examples, that helps. But so does listening, right? So back to the earlier point about trust and listening. If you can try and understand what matters to the audience and frame the conversations in those terms rather than leading with the technical detail, then I don't think you'll go too far wrong. There's not many. I always say that although grid infrastructure is highly topical and in some circles controversial, it's actually one of the easiest to try and sell from a communications perspective, right? Because if you don't like onshore wind but you like offshore, you don't like offshore but you like nuclear, all of that energy needs grid in some way. So my job is made slightly easier in the fact that you can frame the argument slightly differently to different audiences, which is really important at the moment as we head into an election. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Any perspective that you want to add there, David?
Yeah, this is one of the biggest learnings that I've had as a startup founder. I come from a very sort of technical, scientific background, and I look back at the way that I communicated our technology and what we could do sort of 2 years ago to the way we do it now. And I was very focused on the technical detail, and it was 95 point something % accurate, and I felt that was really important. But actually, what is the value of that, and how does that benefit the end user or whatever particular stakeholder? Is it the regulator? Is it the developer? Is it some other sort of conservation group or other stakeholder? So targeting that messaging for the right audience is key, and not getting so held up on the technical detail. And we're also really lucky that we work with underwater imaging data. So we do have some nice images and videos of diving birds and dolphins and seals and things that help to get the message across. So it's a very visual product that we work with.
Excellent. Thank you both. So let's think a little bit now about kind of growth and sustainability. So taking it back into that sort of startup context. So what are the biggest risks to scaling the enterprise that you have at the moment, and how do you plan to mitigate those? What are your thoughts on that, David?
I think it's keeping up with the pace of technological development, also the competitive landscape, and I think we need to act with ambition and urgency, really, in everything that we do. And we're trying to develop technology that kind of keeps pace with everything that's going on around us, and we are trying to kind of mitigate that really by securing external investment, and we've just been lucky enough to close an initial investment round, and that's enabled us to really spend some time now to accelerate the product development, really, to ensure that we kind of keep up with that pace of technological change.
Brilliant, thank you. Gitto, what's your perspective on this? So that sort of scaling and how you're planning to mitigate any risks?
Yeah, I mean, David makes a really important point there about investment, and I think there is. I always say profit shouldn't be a dirty word in Wales. I think that that's something that we need to sort of break the habit of here. As a business, we were really proud last May to close out additional investment from Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. I think to our group of businesses, one of the largest, or the single largest inward investment into Wales for some time, so close to just over £500 million. I think the biggest risks are definitely around planning, timelines, and supply chain capacity. I mean, we've spoken a bit about public acceptance, and that is an issue, but I think the supply chain constraints can really impact delivery timelines and costs. I think we try and mitigate these by engaging early with the supply chain. You speak to any business that's got somebody that is maybe focused on procurement or on supply chain, particularly in the startup world, you're bringing your own little black book in your back pocket with your contacts over the years, right? And I think we've, as a business, we've been really fortunate to have people in procurement and in that supply chain space who have got some fantastic links with the Welsh supply chain. Energy networks, by their very nature, there are things in this country, not just Wales, but across the UK, that we do not make here, which I think sort of is a broader issue that the UK manufacturing sector faces. But I think preparing the supply chain is really important. I think what I would also say is just around staffing and the talent pool. We went, I think, from 10 members of staff at the back end of 2024 to about 55 at the close of year last year, right? So a huge growth in talent. But there is a shortage, particularly when it comes to energy networks, in the amount of energy networks that we're going to need to build and the availability of people. You do not need a degree to be a linesman, for example, right? And I think routes to market for people, if you're a startup, lean on your startup identity to bring in good talent, because it will set you apart, where maybe you might not be able to offer higher salaries. Lean in on that startup mentality, because I think people are looking for something different in the workplace now, not just a higher salary.
Yeah. I'm going to go to the next question, which is around that sort of, because you've queued me up really nicely there, in terms of opportunity for people in that local community. So how do you ensure that there are opportunities for people in the local community to work within the business? How do you go about that, Gitto?
So I think we're really proud of the investment that we're making. So it'll be close to £1 billion by 2030. All of our projects. So it's about 300 kilometres of new grid infrastructure. We are aiming to be submitted, consented, built and energised in line with Clean Power 2030, right? So hugely ambitious. But I think what that then means is that there's a huge potential for local benefit. I'm often very envious of my colleagues in the sector that have very nice community benefit funds. I do not have one because I'm not allowed one because of our Ofgem licence. But what I do have is my supply chain colleagues, And I think there are some incredible small businesses that we've already been working with, on ground investigation, for example, right, using local suppliers, supporting skills development. I was at University of South Wales, start of January, collaborating with education, so Careers Wales. I think we recognise that these projects are short term and long term. So the goal is not just short term construction jobs, but sustained opportunities linked to the operation and the evolution of the energy system. And my last point would be, there might be businesses on this call who are based in Mid and West Wales. There was a survey by Growing Mid Wales, the body that brings together the local authorities, the 3 local authorities in Mid Wales. 80% of them said that they could not grow because of concerns about grid capacity, right? So this is a very real challenge for startups as well, and a lot of startups in rural areas who may be off grid as well, who are finding their costs rising because of the current situation. So yeah, short term and long term opportunities, I'd say.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And David, what about your perspective on that sort of opportunity for local community to work with a business?
Yeah, delivering social impact and growing the green economy locally is a real sort of key pillar of our business, and we've done a bit of a recruitment drive recently where we've weighted it towards people working or from the local area. We're very proud that because we're based in North Wales, around 70% of our workforce is based in North Wales or Northwest England, which is really important to us. And we work a lot with charities and with schools and local universities to provide work placements or other types of employment opportunities or opportunities to upskill people from the local community to provide those opportunities for people to get involved if they're interested in it. And as Gito said, it's also a real sort of enjoyable part of my job is kind of working with those people and see them perhaps do some work in a field that they wouldn't necessarily have thought that they would be able to apply their skills to in sort of marine science or computer science, and then have that realization that suddenly that there's all these other opportunities that are open to them that they hadn't thought of before. It's a really rewarding thing to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine how rewarding that is. Gito, did you want to come back in there?
Yeah, I was just speaking to a colleague a couple of weeks ago. I mean, those of us that work in the energy space, right? You go to any conference or meeting, what accents do you hear in the room? Scottish, right? And I think what we've got a large Scottish contingent in our engineering team, majority Welsh workforce, but our engineering team is predominantly Scottish. And I think, our goal, whilst it sounds nice, is very real in the sense that in 5-10 years' time, we want more Welsh voices and Welsh accents being heard in that space. Scotland made the decision 10-15 years ago to try and be the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy. Wales has got a great opportunity. And the Welsh workforce has got a great opportunity. We see ourselves very much as a bit of a springboard. If you come and work with us, either as a supplier, there's then further opportunities for you with other businesses across the sector as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Let's go to some of the pre-submitted questions now. So we had a question around private and public sector funding. So is private sector funding more reliable than public sector funding? What are your thoughts on this, David?
Perhaps I'll go. Yeah, I mean, reliable, probably. And again, we don't want to go into politics, but given sort of the political situation and upcoming elections in May, we find that sort of private funding They have their own, the private sector have their own sort of goals and objectives that tend to be sort of long term, and have pots of money available, whereas pots of public money tend to get distributed around depending on whatever's sort of in favour at the moment of that particular political party. But I also think it's perhaps more available. There's limited amount of public funds. Whenever we find that we apply for grant funding, there is lots of competition. There are so many sort of startups and SMEs that are applying for public funds that your chance of success is very, very slim. But if you can pitch your idea to a private private financer and get them to buy into your vision, then we found that a better route into achieving funding than through the sort of the public sector.
Brilliant. Gitto, what would you add to that?
I think David sort of analyzes that in a really nice way. I think the reality is it's the approach is probably a mix of the both, right? It's probably a bit of blended finance. So you get the long-term stability of public funding, long-term heavily caveated, together with that sort of agility and innovation incentives of private investment. Our work is all private investment, but there are lots of various businesses in the energy sector and lots of technology that clearly will need some public money as well. And I think governments are looking at that. So what was the UK Infrastructure Bank now? I forget what it's morphed into. I remember when it was the UK Infrastructure Bank, but then you got GB Energy, and government's really starting to think about how does it get a stake in private sector initiatives, whether that's through community ownership and the like. So I think the overall, we spoke earlier about if you've got your goal, everything should work towards it. If the goal is making sure that both support sustainable, lasting outcomes and not just short-term deliverables, then you probably need a mixture of private sector finance and public sector finance in the sector. But in my world, the private sector finance is absolutely critical. You're talking close to £2 million a pylon. The idea of communities owning those is difficult.
Yeah, particularly
Can I just maybe
investment, isn't it? Sure,
make
David.
another point? Sorry, I think that also private sector funding can also open the door to some public sector funding as well, because we find a lot of the public sector funds are either match funded to a certain degree, and as a pre-revenue startup initially, that was very difficult for us to provide the funds for that match funding. But now we've secured some investment. It opens those doors to those opportunities where we can actually part fund some of those research projects ourselves, and hopefully that will then act as a springboard to further accelerate our technological development.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to come to one of the pre-submitted questions. So how to get off the ground as a newly opened company director of a business, and where do you get the leads from? How do you go about it? David, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, take as much help as you can get. There's a lot of help out there. We've worked with Business Wales. We work with Innovate UK Business Growth. As Emma will know, we both come from a background where we've had the protection of sort of a large corporate company that have their own HR department, legal department, finance department, and suddenly you have to do all that yourself as a startup. I didn't have any of that experience, so I wouldn't know where to start. So the likes of Business Wales and Innovate UK have been really, really helpful for that. In terms of identifying leads, I find it really helpful to press the flesh, as it were. Go to conferences, meet people face to face, talk to as many people as possible, and really sort of increase your brand awareness and your visibility. So the best sort of most successful leads that convert to awards, I found have really come from sort of those conversations at conferences, where people have a shared pain point, and you can talk about your experience in the industry, rather than going along sort of cold call sales approaches.
Yeah.
That seems to work best for us.
I mean, David, both you and I have been out on the roads together, and we know that whether it's a large business or a new startup business, absolutely getting yourself out there is so important. And networking, meeting people buy things from people, right?
Exactly,
So yeah, it's really important to have those connections, really. What about your perspective, Gitto, on that sort of where do we get the leads from?
Yeah, I agree with everything David said there. Sort of summarised there, it is a mix of network, visibility, and partnerships. I would also say just really focus on your niche expertise. I know, David, you're saying earlier about looking back on how technical some of the stuff that you were writing was. I think it's also not to lose that as well, right? So it's having the right balance. And I think if you're a startup and you really focus on your niche expertise, if you can be really clear on what problems you solve and who benefits most from your advice, that will make it easier for people to understand your values. So, but completely agree with the other points in terms of building visibility and strategic partnerships and leveraging your existing network as well. That's absolutely critical.
It's back to that vision again, isn't it? Really knowing what you're there for, which is great. Okay, let's take one of the live questions. So what technologies do you believe will have the highest innovation threshold for entrepreneurial success in the next 5 years? What a huge question, guys, to end on. Thoughts on this?
Well, I guess the future is uncertain, right? A few years ago, who would have thought about the technological push that ChatGPT, the launch of ChatGPT, and these sort of generative AI platforms have allowed us, and now it's suddenly, in the space of a couple of years, incorporated into everything we do. It's in our emails, it's in apps on our phone, and everything like that. So I think the genie is out of the bottle in terms of AI. I think we're with anything new, we just need to learn how to sort of harness it the appropriate way. And I think in the next sort of few years, we'll have some really smart tools out there that will make all our lives a lot easier, and hopefully free up some of our time as well, which would be nice.
That'd be lovely, wouldn't it? Gitto, final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I must have anticipated this question, because I did some research very briefly this morning for this other question, and it was that last year more than 320 new energy-related startups raised their first funding in clean energy technologies. And energy-related patents now make up about 1 in 10 of all patents worldwide. So more than in chemicals, transport, or pharmaceuticals. So I think that illustrates just how innovative and globally strategic the sector has become. I would say keep an eye on grid resilience and digital, and probably long duration energy storage as well. I think these are crucial to balance intermittent wind and solar generation. So I think in the next couple of years, keep an eye out for those two in particular.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, guys. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Some key takeaways, I kept making notes because there's so many great things that you were saying, but I love that piece around technology as an enabler for better decisions. The great thing about kind of timing is key when we're making those critical decisions, and that goes across any business. Awareness of those upfront costs, David, you were talking about, and taking that kind of longer term view of, this is an investment. Building those supply chain partnerships, and obviously today we've talked about trying to keep that as close as we can within Wales. Testing, you talked about as well, making sure that you're really looking at things in a really thorough way, balancing those risks, having really transparent engagement with the communities that we work with key stakeholders, creating a leadership model where you've got that great sense of purpose. That vision is so important. Creating a safe space for people to be themselves, visibility, stakeholder conversation. Wow, we've covered an awful lot. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm really appreciate it. So back to Amelia.
Thank you so much, guys. That was fantastic. So that is it for today's session. Thank you to our host, Emma, and to our speakers, David and Gutto, for your insight and expertise. And please stay tuned to hear more about CMI membership. And thank you again for joining us.
Don't forget, as a CMI member, you can find the latest management and leadership insights at managers.org.uk. If you're not yet a member, join our community to discover CMI Confidence with on-demand resources, our network of mentors, and industry-leading accreditations.